This program is supported in part by a grant from the Alaska Humanities Forum and the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency. Major funding was made possible by Royal Caribbean Cruises and Wells Fargo Bank, Alaska. Additional support by the law offices of Simpson, Tillinghast, Sorensen, and Lawrenson.
Alaska, a vast territory of immeasurable beauty, and a storehouse of natural resources that have made it one of the wealthiest states in the Union. Now, oil is king of Alaska's economy, but there was a time when salmon ruled. Before statehood, when Alaska was still a territory, huge canneries owned by non-residents used giant fish traps to compete with local fishermen. That clash, and the mindset of Alaska's military veterans after World War II, were woven together in an unsuspecting way to shape Alaska's future.
Before coming to Alaska, I had already voted for president and for U.S. senator, and I got to Alaska and suddenly, smack in the face, I realized that I lost my basic civil rights, and there were a bunch of many other veterans who came up about the same time who had fought the war to make the world safe for democracy, and here we come to Alaska and we've lost our basic citizenship rights. So a bunch of us got quickly involved in the statehood movement.
Alaskans weren't really that mistreated up here when we were a territory. But we certainly didn't have any political rights. We certainly didn't have control of our destiny.
To secure those rights and achieve that destiny, Alaskans decided to declare them for themselves in a new constitution for a yet-to-be-born state. This is the story of how Alaskans wrote their constitution. The idea of statehood for Alaska had been argued for decades before the territorial legislature convened in 1955. Were the 200,000 residents of Alaska ready to govern themselves? What better way to show a reluctant Congress that Alaska was ready for statehood than to draft a constitution? So territorial leaders collected $300,000 to pay expenses for a convention and ordered it to be held in Fairbanks in November of 1955. To elect delegates, they also ordered a new set of political districts to encourage more grassroots representation.
In the legislature in '55 in which we were doing this work, there were 6 members from the 1st Division. 5 of us were from Juneau. There was 1 from Petersburg. Nobody from Ketchikan, Wrangell, Haines, Sitka, Skagway. From the 3rd Division, there were 10 members. All 10 were from Anchorage. Nobody from Palmer, nobody from Seward, Cordova, Kodiak, any other community in the 3rd Division. The 2nd Division, they were all from Nome. Nobody from Kotzebue, nobody from Unalakleet. Of course, Fairbanks really only had 1 community. I mean, the 4th Division had really only Fairbanks. But we determined the need for providing special election districts that would guarantee representation from any community in the state that had roughly 1,000 people or more.
With the election set for September of '55, candidates for the 55 seats at the Constitutional Convention fanned out in search of votes. Some ran at large, or representing no one community, while others, like Maynard Lomborg, were elected from small villages.
Our mission group had started a grade school in Unalakleet before the turn of the century, and some of the parents approached us and said, well, how about you starting a high school? And so I said, okay, I'll look into that, and we did. I mean, we were very much involved in the concerns of the people, and I guess I felt that I could probably represent that side of life at the convention if I was elected. So.
My slogan was basically, give us one man, one vote. And I used that slogan throughout the whole district. I had a Model 3A Stinson on floats. And I just packed it up and headed on down the Yukon River and up the Kuskokwim River twice. I had an opponent from Bethel, and I handily won the election because I didn't have to worry about all of those people up there in urban America, which was Fairbanks at that time.
It was not a big media campaign. You contacted people you knew in various communities, got their support, they passed word around, and it was very informal. And the main slogan was, I'm for statehood, I have no axe to grind.
Yeah, my campaign, and some guy had been drinking quite a bit of the bubbly, and he came up with a tremendous slogan, the best vote for you is Buckaloo. Well, yeah, it wouldn't get me through the presidency, but it got me through the Constitutional Convention election.
Every political convention needs a presiding officer, and at the 1955 Constitutional Convention, a fair share of delegates thought Bill Egan should be president. Egan was in the territorial legislature at the time. In fact, he'd been Speaker of the House. A grocer by trade, Egan was a Democrat from Valdez, but during the brief campaign to serve as a convention delegate, he had gone out of his way to cross party lines.
That was another thing that made for a very good convention. People ran not as Democrats or Republicans, and there were some young men in Anchorage who had worked together on Operation Statehood, and one of them was Barry White. And Bill Egan, the generous Bill Egan, knew that Barry White was a Republican. He took him with him in Valdez campaigning. And Barry White told me, and he told it to several other people, that he knows that he never would have been elected on his own if it hadn't been that Bill Egan took him under his wing, because he was such a good advocate for statehood.
But as the time came to start the Constitutional Convention, Bill Egan was not the only candidate for presiding officer. Other well-known politicians vied for the honor as well.
Vic Rivers was nominated. E.B. Collins of Fairbanks was nominated. E.B. Collins had been Speaker of the first House of Representatives in 1913, first territorial house. He was 82 years old, and he was and here he was, you know, a person out of Alaska's history.
I think on the first ballot, Bill had 21. And they had made a rule that the way the election would be held would be the person with the lowest would be dropped off at the next balloting so that it wouldn't go on forever.
Yeah, so then we have an elimination process going on and sort of dropping out the lowest vote getter, and Bill Egan gets it in the end. And that was probably a very decisive decision with respect to affecting the success of the Constitutional Convention. Bill Egan was fair, he was considerate, he was humane, he made sure that every delegate had equal opportunity to speak on any issue. Whenever things got too hot, too conflicting on something, he would call an at ease or recess and give people a chance to work things out.
Convention delegates came to Fairbanks armed with their opinions and experience. World War II in particular shaped the views of many delegates, especially the veterans.
The GIs brought into Alaska the Western philosophy. And the GIs that stayed here, they couldn't understand why, as red-blooded Americans that had served their country in the military in the war, didn't have a voice in their government, didn't have a voice in their Congress. And I think that plus the reconstruction after the war, the building of the highway, building of reconstructing the railroad, and those things that happened probably set the tempo for we to be able to have our Constitutional Convention.
While the general mood for a convention was ripe in 1955, the actual homework needed to write a constitution fell to a handful of people, including Tom Stewart, the convention secretary. He recruited experts from around the country.
And I traveled with one or more of these consultants to Fairbanks, to Anchorage, to Kotzebue, to Nome, to Kodiak, and introduced them to the mayors, the school superintendents, and gave them a chance to talk with local leaders to get a feel, especially in the local government area, what should be done for local government. And they wrote papers, paper on the Bill of Rights, a paper on the executive branch, on the legislative branch, on the judicial branch, on finance and taxation, on apportionment of the legislature, on elections, on local government, and on natural resources. They wrote papers that didn't try to tell the delegates what to do, but they said, here is the way other states in their constitutions have approached this subject. Ultimately, the articles that they wrote on the topics of constitutional articles were compiled into a 3-volume set of studies, which was ready when the convention assembled in November in Fairbanks.
While Stewart commissioned written research, it took a vote of the convention before any outside experts were invited to Fairbanks.
One of the consultants that I had lined up was a wonderful man named Sheldon Elliott. Sheldon lived in New York City. He was the head of the Institute for Judicial Administration. And so I was promoting Sheldon as a consultant for the Judiciary Committee. Chairman of the Judiciary Committee was a lawyer from Anchorage whom I knew well, named George McLaughlin. George knew that I had talked with other delegates about the availability of Sheldon Elliott, and he was opposed. He didn't want any carpetbaggers.
McLaughlin and Elliott soon became friends, however, and together they helped shape the formation of Alaska's judicial system.
And I'm sure that the judiciary article was, as it is, which is a fine, fine article. It's the envy of every other state. Shows his handicraft as well as McLaughlin. And we had a man from the League of American Cities, John Bebout, who was an article written about him in the New York Times, Mr. Constitution, and a very, very fine professor from Louisiana State University named Kimbrough Owen. Kim Owen was the advisor to the Committee on Style and Drafting, and he said to them, this language must sing, it must have rhythm, must have a consistency.
It was one of Kimbrough Owen's last acts. Just 2 months later, he died in a plane crash. As it turned out, another consultant from Louisiana addressed delegates that winter. He paid his own way to Fairbanks and had one mission: convincing Alaska that, like Tennessee, it should elect a delegation to lobby Congress for statehood.
I talked to a number of Alaskans that claimed credit for it, but I think that George Lee Leitner, of all places, from that Citadel of Liberty in Louisiana, came up and talked to the delegates, and he's the one that sold the Alaska-Tennessee plan to the delegates at the convention.
And right at first, several of us were opposed to that. I just thought it was a little too brash. But the more you got to thinking about it, that maybe this is what was necessary. And the individuals that went were strong individuals: Bill Egan, and Greening, and Ralph Rivers. And then Bob Bartlett being there, that gave a pretty good lobbying committee, per se.
The time and place of the convention were set by the legislature, but not without some debate. Tom Stewart remembers who gave him the idea of holding the convention in Fairbanks.
New Jersey had held a very successful constitutional convention in 1946 and had produced an acclaimed modernized state constitution. And I went to Trenton where some of those people lived. Particularly, I talked to two of the officers of the New Jersey Convention. One was a woman named Katzenbach. She was the one that persuaded me that we should have our convention at Fairbanks, at the university campus, rather than in the Capitol in Juneau.
Stewart had some practical experience that influenced his selection of Fairbanks. It revolved around the closing days of the 1953 territorial session.
That session, I remember distinctly going into the men's room, and there was a wastebasket that was tall, and it was filled to the brim with whiskey bottles, mainly whiskey being consumed by the members. The Speaker of the House was a man from Fairbanks named George Miskovich, who was a Republican and a miner from Fairbanks. And he had in his desk drawer a coffee cup, but he filled it with whiskey behind the desk. And the House was in such a shambles that they never did adjourn. They just got up and went home in the middle of the night.
Despite the anger of some of his Juneau constituents, Stewart insisted on holding the Constitutional Convention in Fairbanks, and delegates from other towns quickly saw his wisdom.
It was not taken seriously by, you might say, the special interests, the banking interests were not there. The fisheries lobbies were not there.
Really was kind of an academic drill. I mean, I think the lobbyists and everybody else figured, well, hell, those guys are not going to get to be a state anytime this century. I don't know what they thought, but it wasn't significant enough for them to waste any money or time.
That kind of isolation could not be duplicated at a second Constitutional Convention, but delegates at the first one believe a few rules could be reenacted, such as a 75-day time limit.
75 days is amazingly short. I don't know how they picked 75 days, but you end up working day and night. I often wondered what would happen if at the end we just say to the territory and the ones that were involved with the stated commission that, look, sorry, we just are not finished with this. I don't think anyone would dare to even have thought of that.
The time limit contributed to the brevity of the proposed Constitution. In roughly 12,000 words, the 1955 convention laid out a blueprint for a new state. George Sundborg, a former newspaper reporter, was chairman of the Style and Drafting Committee.
I'm sure I was chosen because of my background as a writer. Yeah, I was considered to be somebody who could work with words. So that was my job, and it was very hard to get some of the delegates to agree to the changes which we recommended. They had a pride of authorship in what they had proposed, and they liked the language, and especially the lawyers. They liked language that, went all around Robin Hood's barn and put in a lot of herewiths and thereafters and so on, and we cut all that junk out and made it very simple and easy to understand.
The convention did most of its work in public, even if the public paid little attention at the time. And that's a lesson for any future convention.
I remember early on there was some rumor that a bunch of people from Southeast Alaska had gotten together after the session. And I think they were probably talking about moving the capital. And one of the delegates went to the chairman of the Rules Committee and said, I hear that there was a caucus that was not announced. And I'll tell you, I'll warn you right now, if that ever happens again, I'll blow you all this convention wide open. And you know that it never happened again.
Finally, after 74 days of debate and wordsmithing, the convention delegates met on February 5th to sign the proposed Constitution. One delegate, who objected to various parts of the document, boycotted the signing ceremony. But for most of the 54 others, the day was an emotional one.
So when it came the time that I had to call the roll for the last time, I felt like, I'm so privileged to have been. I mean, it was not work, it was a privilege. And I think there wasn't a dry eye when I looked up. I mean, there were some hard-nosed guys sitting there in the front row, and I saw that there were tears even in their eyes.
But when delegates left Fairbanks that February, they had just 2 short months to explain the proposed Constitution to voters. Would Alaskans endorse the Constitution, or even bother to vote? Some Alaskans argued a better Constitution could be drafted after statehood, not before. But the election that April of 1956 was not just about a draft Constitution. As fashioned by the Constitutional Convention, the ballot was also about fish traps.
The processors were located, their headquarters were all down south, and they had the traps, so all the fish they caught, they were theirs. And these traps were huge, they were really big. Anyway, and they took their money and they took their crews and went south, and that was it. And all the money went with them.
Fish traps were kind of, I guess, like slavery in the South. It was a real evil with the fishermen, and of course it was an economic bonanza for the guys that owned the traps. And then the Alaskans had to get out in those little boats in the rough water with the nets, and so it was kind of an unequal economic opportunity of a monstrous shape. But so it was a kind of an issue that would bring the voters out.
And a good many coastal candidates had used the trap issue as a campaign issue in getting there in the first place. Elder is a good friend of mine, was then, and talked to me rather regularly on, I can't go back to Petersburg until we address traps realistically.
But delegates were reluctant to put a specific ban on fish traps into a general body of law, the Constitution. The ballot measure, a law that would take effect the moment Alaska became a state, was very simple.
Just said that fish traps are abolished in all the territorial waters, and that was really, the traps were gone when Alaska became a state, but my thinking was that if we had that separate ordinance, that more people would get out and vote, particularly in the outlying areas. They knew that they had to be a state, and they had to get rid of it. The only way they're going to get rid of the fish traps was to vote yes on the Constitution and yes on the abolition of fish trap.
The strategy worked. Alaskans voted 2-1 for the Constitution and 5-1 to ban fish traps. When Congress voted 3 years later to admit Alaska to the Union, both became law. A lot has changed in Alaska since 1955. The discovery of oil generated unimagined wealth for the state, bringing new technology and many new residents to Alaska. More than 24 times they've voted to amend the Constitution, to create the Alaska Permanent Fund, for example, or limit entry to commercial fisheries. But voters so far have been reluctant to authorize another constitutional convention.
Maybe it's not as easy to amend as some, but we have left it up to the people every 10 years to say if we want a convention, we'll vote for it.
That if we had a constitutional convention, you would find a tremendous amount of legislative law put into the Constitution. I think our Constitution would be like the California Constitution. It would take a bookcase instead of a pamphlet.
I have a hunch that if we had a convention, that even if people came with special interest in whatever they had access to grind, by the time they got together and started thinking about the seriousness of what they're doing, that it isn't just pushing a particular idea, but that they're dealing with the next decades of the state of Alaska, that again a unity would be created, and that the common good, the public good would prevail. That is my optimistic hope.
This program is supported in part by a grant from the Alaska Humanities Forum and the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency. Major funding was made possible by Royal Caribbean Cruises and Wells Fargo Bank, Alaska. Additional support by the law offices of Simpson, Tillinghast, Sorensen, and Lawrenson.